The last one.
Blessed is the kingdom of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and forever, and to the ages of ages.
You're watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Welcome back to Reason and Theology, everyone. Your host, Michael, here. Going to be, I'm already actually joined by Kevin Symonds. Normally I bring him on the screen, but he's already on there. Kevin, how are you?
I'm okay. How about yourself?
Doing good. Have you back on to discuss Our Lady of Fatima, especially her words. The Holy Father will have much to suffer, continuing our series here on Our Lady of Fatima and its message as part of the webinar. So what I'll do is pass it over to you to maybe just kind of introduce the video that we're going to be watching here in just a second.
All right. Yeah, so we're continuing developing the theme about like the crisis of faith and the lack of faith that we've been experiencing. And so that's kind of broad context here, but now I kind of want to get into a little bit more of the struggles of the popes during this time. Our Lady had prophesied in Fatima that the Holy Father will have much to suffer. Well, what does this mean? Certainly we can talk about Pius XI, Pius the 12th, but we don't often connect John Paul I, Paul VI, John the 23rd to these to those words. There's been a lot of connecting of John Paul II to them, but I kind of want to focus a little bit on what was going on in the 1960s onward, because in the third part of The Secret, it was Our Lady had Sister Lucia put on the outside of the envelopes that famous date of 1960 as the year that they could be opened and read by the Cardinal Patriarch of Lisbon or the Bishop of Leiria. So, kind of taking that again as a key date, what was going on in the 60s? You know, Sister Lucia herself, we said that communism would reach its high point or its zenith in the 60s. Well, we definitely see that happening, but let's get a little more practical. How did that look? And that's what I want to focus a little bit, kind of zone in a little bit in this webinar.
Awesome. Okay, let me go ahead and share the screen. Y'all let me know if there's any issues with the audio. Y'all should be able to hear it. I just enabled the audio right now. So
yeah, I hope it rendered okay. When I made the video, a previous video a few weeks ago, I noticed there was some defects. That wasn't in how I organized the timeline, but for some reason it just defected when it rendered. I don't know. So if there's something that comes up, we could just maybe fix it in post discussion or something.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and play it.
All right.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Webinar 5 of our series about Fatima and revisiting the Church's interpretation of the third part of the Secret of Fatima. In the fourth webinar, we focused upon the lack of faith present within the world at the time of and after Vatican II. The struggles of the popes during are the focus of this present webinar. The Holy Father will have much to suffer. These words of Our Lady at Fatima come to mind when we look at the difficulties posed by an inherent atheism that permeated the world. In the first and second parts of The Secret of Fatima, Our Lady never specified the type or kind of suffering the Pope would endure if her requests were not heeded. Certainly, we can speak of the sufferings of Pope Pius XII with respect to the spreading of Russia's errors, at the very least. In keeping, however, with our previous webinar, I'd like to focus here upon Pope St. Paul VI. I venture to say that for Pope Paul VI, his suffering most certainly involved the anguish that arises from isolation in the midst of the revolt in the Church. The revolt came early in Paul's pontificate, but the year 1968 is when the revolt took on a very public face. In this year, Paul VI issued his last encyclical Humanae Vitae, in which he upheld the perennial teaching of the Church against artificial contraception. This was a very hot button topic at the time, as the sexual revolution was then underway, and it was believed by many that the Holy Father would reverse the Church's prohibition on artificial contraception. When this expectation was not met, the rebellion in and outside the Church over the Holy Father's decision was very pronounced. So much so that a couple of weeks before his death in September 1968, St. Padre Pio wrote a famous letter to support the Holy Father. Padre Pio wrote, quote, I know that your heart suffers much these days on account of the happenings in the Church, for peace in the world, for the great needs of its peoples, but above all for the lack of obedience of some, even Catholics, to the lofty teachings which you, assisted by the Holy Spirit and in the name of God, have given us. I offer your holiness my daily prayers and sufferings, the insignificant but sincere offering of the least of your sons, asking the Lord to comfort you with his grace, to continue along the direct yet often burdensome way in defense of those eternal truths which can never change with the times. End quote. One cannot escape the fact that for such an open revolt to take place, something was wrong. Pope Paul VI specified that the errors were the heresy of modernism, quote, under other names, end quote. It is clear that a serious crisis of faith manifested in relation to the errors of Russia being spread. Those errors dimmed the supernatural light of faith in the minds and hearts of men. They turned inward, collapsing in on themselves, choosing to pursue instead atheistic humanism, either in practice or in fact, and rebelled against God, his Church, and her holy doctrines and dogmas. Implied in Our Lady's discourse in the Secret of Fatima is an indictment of the rebellion. The first part reminds us of the rebellion's eternal consequences. The second part shows the earthly consequences, i.e., if man does not cease to offend God, while at the same time providing heaven's remedy. Finally, in the third part, those faithful to the gospel give witness, martyr, to Jesus to the point of shedding their blood and making expiation. Such is the fate of the just, which, while conducive to salvation, did not have to happen if Our Lady had been heeded. Our Lady's discourse is also an exhortation to pray for conversion. Those who remain faithful to the gospel of Jesus Christ will be martyred by those who have turned away from the supernatural light and life of faith. Where there is martyrdom, there is some evil force promoting the martyrdom. Thus, why can't those who are faithful to Christ and his holy and saving doctrine in the midst of the rebellion, causing a crisis in the Church, be included in the vision of the third part of the secret? In the second webinar, I quoted Sister Lucia in her book, How I See the Message, Como Vejo a Mensagem, about how communism was the greatest heresy. According to St. Thomas Aquinas, heresy denotes a choosing. It is, he says, quote, a species of unbelief belonging to those who profess the Christian faith but corrupt its dogmas, end quote. There are two ways that heresy can be committed. The first is that a man is unwilling to assent to Christ. The second is that a man fails in his choice of those things wherein he assents to Christ because he chooses not what Christ really taught, but the suggestions of his own mind. In other words, people can choose to reject Christ from the outset, the first way, or as a baptized Christian, choose contrary to Christ, the second way. Thus, heresy is a choice made against matters pertaining to faith. This choice, Aquinas further taught, can be made directly and principally against the articles of faith, or indirectly and secondarily against matters where the denial of which leads to the corruption of some article of faith. Communism, as we have said, depends upon atheism. Pope Pius XI's encyclical Divini Redemptoris explains how communism both directly and indirectly attacks divine and Catholic faith. Pius XI describes communism as, quote, a system full of errors and sophisms. It is in opposition both to reason and to divine revelation. It subverts the social order because it means the destruction of its foundations, because it ignores the true origin and purpose of the state, because it denies the rights, dignity, and liberty of human personality, end quote. Simply put, communism attempts to overthrow God from the center and foundation of society and the human person, to destroy his reign in the hearts of men. In such a society, people are inculcated into the errors of atheistic communism, and by such, they do not choose God. The question of apostasy is related to heresy, but it is slightly different. It too concerns unbelief, says Aquinas, but of a different kind. Heresy is the choosing of something else other than what Christ has taught, whereas apostasy is a backsliding from God. It also has a few different manifestations. These manifestations are, as Aquinas wrote, quote, according to the different kinds of union between man and God, end quote. These manifestations are 1. Rejecting God altogether, apostasy of perfidy. 2. Disobeying God's commandments, apostasy from God. And 3. Turning away from one's religious or priestly vocation, apostasy of religious life or orders. Who can deny that since the 1960s we have seen just such an apostasy? Sister Lucia herself gave several indications that the Church was going through a trial, a kind of passion, in which some of her members might apostatize. On April 12, 1970, Lucia wrote a letter to Maria Teresa Pereira de Cunha in which she recommended the prayer of the Rosary. The reason for this recommending was to prevent us from being deceived by, quote, false doctrines, end quote. During what she called the diabolical disorientation, Sister placed much emphasis upon the leaders of the Church in this same letter. Sister Lucia again wrote about the importance of the Rosary in her September 16, 1970 letter to Mother Martins. Sister Lucia commented that, quote, the devil had moved against it such a great war. She further stated that the devil had deluded and deceived souls of great responsibility for their position. They are blind men leading blind men, end quote. Sister then tied in the delusions and deceptions of such people with respect to the Second Vatican Council. Quote, they pretend to base their opinions in the Council and do not realize that the Holy Council ordered them to preserve all the practices that in the course of years had been fostered in honor of the Immaculate Virgin Mother of God. End quote. On April 13, 1971, Sister Lucia wrote to her nephew, Father Jose Velino, a Salesian priest. In this letter, she speaks of the, quote, turmoil and disorientation of our times, as well as a diabolical wave that is sweeping the world, end quote. She identifies the principal error as being people having abandoned prayer. In so doing, quote, they turn away from God, and without God, everything is lacking to them, end quote. As an antidote, Sister Lucia encourages her nephew to draw close to the tabernacle and pray. In their 2013 biography, the Carmelites of Coimbra reveal a more intimate moment in Sister Lucia's life involving the rebellion in the Church. She wrote on December 31st, 1979, about another apparition from Our Lady, wherein Sister Lucia was comforted in the midst of her anguish over events in the Church. According to the account in Lucia's private diary, Our Lady said, quote, God has heard your prayer and sent me to tell you that it is necessary to intensify your prayer and your work for the union of the Church, of the bishops with the Holy Father, and of the priests with the bishops, to lead the people of God on the paths of truth, faith, hope, and love, united in Christ their Savior. End quote. These indications from Sister Lucia show that a trial, a passion, connected to the spread of Russia's errors began. Those errors are intrinsically united to atheism and materialism, which dim the supernatural light and life of faith in the minds and hearts of men. Many people have become, for all sakes and purposes being, atheists, either practical or actual, choosing to rely upon human conventional means rather than the supernatural light of faith. Is this, however, the end of the story, or is there more? We shall conclude our discussion in the next and final webinar. I open the floor now for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, excellent job. I like the little subscribe part at the bottom there too. That was done really well. By the way, I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
Mm.
Yeah, I worked really hard on that. I had a little tutorial video with the people that make the video editing program that I use, and I was expanding upon it, having a lot of fun, and I was playing around in Photoshop with the chrome for the silver thing, and I was just like, I don't know, I was just having a lot of fun. But the red thing was the hardest thing to do, actually. The rest of it was simple, but that red was the hardest to figure out because you had to play around with the in the Photoshop settings, and I couldn't get it just right or what I was looking for. And then I think I just clicked a button, and all of a sudden, boom, it turned, and I was like, oh, I got it.
That's funny.
I'm not a Photoshop master, but I
was
learn
done
as I
well.
go.
It was done well. All right. Well, here's given in your excellent book, you say that Father Fuentes was working on the cause for JNF. Why didn't he have a tape recorder or a stenographer with him when he saw Sister?
Okay. That well, first, this question is in relation to the Father Augustin Fuentes story, where he went to see Sister Lucia in the Carmel of Coimbra convent in 1957. I think it was December, sometime in 57. I think it was. And at the time, he was the postulator or the vice postulator for the causes of Jacinta and Francisco Marto, of course, now Saints Jacinta and Francisco Marto. He later gave a talk to a group of nuns in Mexico where he made certain claims about, and then he wrote it, I think, in a publication that he had. Forgive if I mispronounce the Spanish. I can't remember where the accent is placed. It's either Hacia or Hacia Los Altares, and it basically means to the heights. And he recounted things in Spanish about his conversation with Sister Lucia, and it became very, very controversial, and for many different reasons. And to make Nick Monk's question here is in relation to why didn't he record it, or with some kind of an audio device. Well, I can't answer that because I wasn't in the room, and there's no available historical documentation to explain why. But I can tell you that this is late 1950s Portugal, and we think nowadays in terms of how everything is in readily at our fingertips in the digital age. Portugal was not wasn't there. And I don't want to say Portugal was backwards or behind the times or anything. I don't want to say that, but Portuguese culture developed along different lines than many other places in Western civilization. And so because of that, some of the technology didn't really make it to the larger areas or different areas of Portugal. And I know this not because I have studied it, but because I have somebody who is Portuguese, who lives in Portugal, and he and I talk about all things Fatima. He himself has told me about this background. So this is not me speaking. This is a native Portuguese man who was a scholar talking about his own country's history. I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but is there some static going on?
No, that's some background noise on my end.
Oh, okay. Just want to make sure. So if he didn't have a device, he probably didn't think it was necessary, or it may not have been on hand, because Father Fuentes himself was not Portuguese. He was Mexican. And so transporting things in the 50s, I mean, there's all different kinds of considerations here. So I don't know for sure, but I can offer these considerations for our thoughts. I will say, though, that my research, and this is chapter 5 here of my book on the third part of Secret of Fatima, I may have uncovered the solution to that difficulty with that story. As a matter of fact, I think it was just yesterday you had debated with Tim Flanders. Is that right, Mr. Lofton?
Right.
You did? Okay. Well, he and I we got to talking about this, and then shortly thereafter, he was debating with, or really discussing, not really debating, but with Kennedy Hall about this, and he didn't bring up the points that I made in chapter 5 of my book, and I was just like, Tim, what are you doing? You could have ended that whole discussion. Basically, what I uncovered in my research is Sister Lucia was given or explained a certain text about what Father Fuentes had said. But the text that was floating around Portugal was based upon, it was a Portuguese text that itself was based upon an English translation. That English translation was not in harmony with the known Spanish text, the Spanish original, as published in Father Joaquin Maria Alonso's book, The Secret of Fatima. And I said, well, okay, Sister Lucia denounced. She made a statement saying that I didn't say these things to Father Fuentes. Well, the question is, what text got to her? The Portuguese bad translation, or the actual Spanish original presented to her in Portuguese? We don't know. That question is open in the history. Depending upon the answer to that question, we might know exactly what happened, and therefore we can possibly reconcile that difficult area of Fatima's history.
Weinschel asks, Kevin, is there any specific significance in Our Lady choosing to speak to children all these important messages?
There is a writer over in England named Donald Anthony Foley. He just published what is essentially the third iteration of his book on Medjugorje, but he also has another book about Marian apparitions in general, and he talks about how children generally tend to be more receptive. They're less influenced by the world, and so they are more, not eligible, but they are better able to communicate something from heaven. That's Donald Foley's position. I think there's merit to what Foley says, and so I would offer that as one explanation for it. Now, that's not exclusive in the history of the Church. There are adults as well that do experience these things, but you have to be careful, because if you have an adult, there could be more, what is the popular term now is baggage there, and they have more filters through which they can interpret things, and sometimes that can become a danger, because if you are offering your interpretation as opposed to what was actually said, if I may give an example, and I know it's every analogy limps, but if anybody remembers that TV show, The Ghost Whisperer, with Jennifer Love Hewitt, I think she used to play on the TV show Party of Five. If you know, she in the show, she could see ghosts and spirits, and they would communicate stuff to her meant for the living. Well, if you watch even a couple of episodes, I guess, but you see how the ghost will say something to Jennifer Love Hewitt's character. I don't remember her character's name. And she would then tell the living person whatever the message was. But if you watch carefully, you see that there's some interpretation between what the ghost says and what comes out of Jennifer Love Hewitt's mouth to this living person. I remember watching that TV show, and I was like, that's exactly what we say in theology here about interpretation and visionaries. You have to be very careful. So I think that's a good example of it. Now, I don't endorse Ghost Whisperer insofar as some of its stuff is like very New Age. It's based upon certain New Age premises with like psychics and mediums and stuff like that. I don't endorse the TV show on that level. But insofar as it portrays the point that I'm making here, I want to offer that as a concrete example as a visual of what I'm saying.
This is a follow-up from Nick Monk. And what happened to Father Fuentes later? Did he help with the cause of Jacinta eventually?
Well, he was at that time, But because of the controversy, or I should say, around the time of this controversy, after it had happened, he was no longer involved with the causes of Jacinta and Francisco Marto. There are those who believe that that was because he made these imprudent statements, or these imprudent disclosures, attributing things to Sister Lucia that, in fact, that turned out not to be true. But again, if we look at it from the perspective of what did Sister Lucia see, what was she given that she looked at and disagreed with, we don't know. That's not entirely too clear just yet. If I remember my research correctly, I think it was the Bishop of Coimbra who went to her in the 1950s and asked her for her opinion on this. That wasn't really a too well-known a fact at the time, but I did some research in the Fatima archives about 4 or 5 years ago, and I came across a newspaper article, I think, an interview with the bishop, Bishop Ernesto, I think his name was. And I think he said that he was the one that went to her. I could be wrong, but I seem to remember in the documentation from the shrine itself, Fatima, that it was the Bishop of Coimbra, Bishop Ernesto, I want to say specifically, who obtained that. I think the Portuguese is desmentida, kind of like a warning or an. But I think it was Bishop Ernesto, and that's an important point because that's not a very well-known public fact. So I'd throw that out there for everybody to. And please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going back a few years, and I've had a lot in my mind lately, so I might be misremembering my facts here.
Since you brought up Padre Pio in the video, let me ask you a question. Do we know what his perspective on Fatima was? I know he had a devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, but do we know specifically what he thought maybe about the third secret or something like that?
There's a lot of controversy actually about that, some discussion, because Padre Gabriele Amort over in Rome, probably the world's most well-known leading exorcist until his death a few years ago, he knew St. Padre Pio and made some claims about Padre Pio. And so it's hard to reconcile certain things because there's no real evidence that's been offered. There's a famous story how Padre Pio was afflicted with an illness. I can't remember if it was the 40s or the 50s. And and the statue of Our Lady, the Pilgrim Virgin of Fatima statue, had come to San Giovanni Rotondo, I think it was, or someplace close by, but he wasn't able to see the statue.
Yeah, I recall that. But that's all I know about it in relation to him.
Yeah. Father Amort seems to think that there was a deeper connection, that that Padre Pio knew what the third part of the secret of Fatima was. Personally, I see evidence that compels me to agree with Father Amort on that point alone, that Padre Pio would have known the third part of the secret of Fatima through his own mystical experiences. As a matter of fact, if people were paying very close attention to how I constructed this fifth webinar, that actually comes out. A proper interpretation of this webinar on this point is Padre Pio and Sister Lucia wrote letters to Pope Paul VI roughly around the same time. Padre Pio in September of 68, Sister Lucia into Pope Paul VI in 1969. And Sister Lucia's letter was something that I had revealed to the world in November of 2017 in an article with Catholic World Report. Matthew Hoffman had interviewed me for that publication, and I revealed the existence of this letter. This letter was essentially her reply to the Holy Father when he appeared in Fatima in May of 67, and she was trying to speak with him, trying to get basically what we call a private audience with the Holy Father. She wanted to speak with him privately, and he had refused it. And so this letter was basically her response to the Holy Father, because he told her to write it down and give it to the bishop, who will then give it to the Holy Father. Well, she did write it down, and I've seen the first page of that letter, and it's extremely profound. What Padre Pio wrote and what she wrote are basically one and the same. So, at least from what I saw, just the first page of her letter. And so I look at that and I say, I think there's good reason to believe that St. Padre Pio was very well aware of what was going on there in the 60s and that rebellion. And that it was likely he would have known that it was connected to Fatima. I don't know for a fact, but I have reason to believe that he likely had some knowledge of what was going on there likely through some mystical means.
But didn't Father Amort go on to say more than that about the third secret that I don't recall exactly, but he started to hint at the third secret still being hidden, I think.
Yes. And may I be blessed if I could find the book. There is a book that came out a few years ago called, oh man, what was it called? It was written by a guy named Zavala. I have a copy of it. I just don't know where it went. I thought I had all my Fatima books right here, but I must have been mistaken. Zavala wrote a book, and I have an article about it on my website. And he makes some claims. He says that he received information from Father Amort before Amort died, and Amort had made him talk like he can only reveal it after his death. And supposedly, there was a text of the third part of the Secret of Fatima that this Zavala guy had published. I don't think this was in connection to Amort, strictly speaking. I think it was a separate thing. I wish I could find the book. I'm so sorry. I feel bad. I don't have it right in front of me. I got to find it. That book's kind of important.
No problem.
So I might be confusing my facts. I apologize. It's in Spanish, so there is no English translation of the book available as of this time, to the best of my knowledge. But he says that there was a second text to the third part of the Secret of Fatima, and I actually might have a copy of this. I'll talk, I guess, while I'm doing this. But he alleged that there was he got this from somebody, Zavala said in the book, and he made the claims that what was it? That this text was the hidden text of the third part of the Secret of Fatima that many people were talking about. And I thought that was a bit bunk. As I paid attention to what to what the argument was, I kept saying to myself, this isn't making any sense. And the reason why, at least in part, it wasn't making any sense was because it fit too well the popular stories about the third part of the Secret of Fatima. So, for instance, it said how there's that famous story about the 20 to 25 lines of text, how the third part of the secret was comprised of that many lines of text. Well, as I showed in my book, there's no real support for that. And I'm not finding the image, but there's no real support in the documentation for that. It was actually based upon a misunderstanding and an interpretation of a French writer by the name of Frère Michel de la Sainte Trinité. I found it. Okay. We can do share screen, right? Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'm reluctant in a way to advertise for this, but Let me just pull this up here real quick. Share screen. Okay. Yeah, share screen. Here we go. Okay. So I doubt anybody can see my cursor, but this is the supposed text that Zavala was promoting, if I remember correctly, a few years ago, saying that this was the real text of the third part of the secret. And that it was dated to the 21st, I think, of December 1944. No, I apologize. No, yeah, the 9th of June. I'm not speaking right. The January 9th of whatever this thing is here. Let me just zoom in here. Yeah. And then it even says like 911 or 19. Like the dating doesn't even make any sense. This is either January 9th or September 1st, and whatever all of that is. It's not making any sense. If you see the date up there in the upper right hand corner, that's where I'm looking. So first of all, if this is a 9, January 9th, whatever the year is, presumably 1944, but it's not making any sense how it's written. Well, that fits perfectly into what various traditionalist writers have been saying about Fatima. Some of them have argued that she wrote the third part of The Secret that was published in June of 2000 on the 3rd of January. But then supposedly there was another text that she had written on January 9th. Father Paul Kramer talks about this in his book, The Devil's Final Battle, which you'll see a copy right here. So the fact that this plays right into that is a problem, because that reading of Father Kramer, really, it's actually Father Nicholas Gruner. Gruner wrote that book. It wasn't Kramer. Kramer has already publicly admitted that his name was just on it because Father Gruner said it would be better received if your name was on it. But that book was all Gruner, essentially. Putting it together, organizing it, etc. So it's Gruner by proxy, if you will. It was a misunderstanding of the Portuguese. Sister Lucia had written how she communicated the third part of The Secret down in 1944. And some people said that I don't remember the exact Portuguese words and whatnot, but some people said she wrote down 2 texts. But the original Portuguese doesn't support that. She said that she wrote the text and put it in an envelope. And then what confused people is she then said, and it is in the notebooks. So people interpreted her as saying there's 2 different texts, one in an envelope and another that she had put into her notebook. That's not what she was talking about. She was talking about the one document that she had put into the envelopes, because now we know now there were 2 envelopes there. Really, well, I guess really 3, if you include the one for the bishop. And she put the envelopes into the notebook so that it was protected, because she didn't want to bring attention to the text going to the Bishop of Fatima, who at that time was Don Jose da Silva. So the bishop, who she had given the titular bishop of Gurza, that she had given the notebooks to, she tucked the envelope in the notebooks to keep the fact of the envelope's existence a little more secret. She kept it, meant it to be surreptitious. But people said she put 2 different things. She gave 2 different documents, and that's not what the Portuguese says. It was a mistranslation. So the fact, and supposedly she wrote one on the 3rd and the other on January 9th. So the fact that this document has that date, presuming that's a 9 and not a 4, that plays right into the misinterpretation of the history, suggesting a forgery. Now, the number of the lines of text that we see here is between 20 and 25. That plays into the other argument that I mentioned that Frère Michel de la Sainte Trinité talked about in his book, Toute la vérité sur Fatima, the whole truth about Fatima, volume 3, in which he speculated that the text was between 20 and 25 lines. People thought that the second bishop of Fatima, João Pereira Venancio, supposedly told Frère Michel that the text was 20 to 25 lines. No. Venancio said no such thing. As a matter of fact, I myself studied the document that Venancio left behind for the archives at the sanctuary. This was in, I think, September of 2016, so 5 years ago. I held the document in my hand. He actually reproduced the envelopes. He found similar envelopes. I don't know if they were the same brand or not, but he found similar envelopes. And he wrote outside, on the outside of the envelopes. And the first person who brought our attention to this was the Portuguese writer Aura Miguel. Wonderful, wonderful lady, by the way. I had the privilege of meeting her in Fatima in September of 2016. On page, let's see, 136 of her book, The Secret That Conducts the Popes, or the Italian, what was translated as Totus Tuus, but the Experience of Fatima and the Pontificate of John Paul II. She transcribes what Bishop Venancio had put on the envelopes, and then I myself saw the envelopes, and I noticed that the transcription in her book was actually not accurate. so I said to her, I said, I saw the document just the other day in the archives, and what was in your book and what was on that paper are a little two different things. And she's like, yeah, I don't know what the editors did there. They added the dimensions, whereas, it wasn't in the actual document. I was like, oh no. That's the next conspiracy, that Aura Miguel was trying to fabricate a document. That's the next conspiracy theory we're going to have to deal with next. We have to, just go crazy on. But the point is, when you look at the text, and it's very, very clear, even in the transcription here in the book, this particular edition, Bishop Venancio does not say that it was 20 to 25 lines of text. There's no mention of that in the document that he left behind. I've seen it. It was in blue pen on the envelope. No. But people ran with this. They had been running with it for roughly from the time the books from Frère Michel were published in French, and then translated into English in the late 80s, early 90s by Father Gruner and his Fatima Center associates. John Colarafi, I believe, was the gentleman who translated it. So once this got into the English language, nobody contradicted the 20 to 25 lines, because up to the year 2000, the third part of The Secret had not been published. So that number had just seeped into the popular mind. And then when it was published in the text in 2000, people were like, wait a minute, this doesn't jive with what Bishop Venancio said. But nobody thought to look back at what Frère Michel actually said. He did not say Venancio said that. That was his own speculation based upon what the bishop had said to him in the 1980s verbally. So the question is, if it's speculation, was Frère Michel right? No, he wasn't. He was wrong. And there's all kinds of ins and outs for that. And if people want to know more of the arguments, I think it's chapter 2 of my book on Fatima, where I kind of walk everybody through the documents, the books, who said what, and all that. So the fact that this document that we have up here on the screen has that 20 plays into the 20 to 25 lines of text also indicates that this is a false document. And also the fact that it plays into a lot of the apocalyptical fears that people have had about Fatima that don't necessarily fit the larger story of Fatima. That also suggests a false document. It's written in a style that is very, very resembles Sister Lucia's actual handwriting. Whoever wrote this, they did this extremely well. But I don't look at it from the handwriting perspective to see if it's false or not. I look at what does it say, what are some of the other, what are the statements, and does it jive with the larger known history, the actual history, not the history of Fatima as individuals want it to be or think it to be, but what it actually is. So I absolutely condemn this document as a forgery. I have no problem saying that. I only wish I knew who forged it, because I'd expose them faster than anything. Because that person needs to be publicly shamed, quite frankly, for inflicting this fraud upon the church. But unfortunately, Zavala fell for it. If this is the document, I think that was connected, because unfortunately I don't have the book in front of me. But unfortunately, he fell for it and was promulgating this a few years ago in his book, and it made some waves. But yeah, it's not a legitimate document. So I would say to people, if you see this, just disregard it.
Last one here from Nick Monk. Did you hear that a handwriting expert has confirmed that the third secret released in 2000 is genuine in Lucia's own handwriting? Some people are a bit disappointed.
Yes, I think that was actually a study that was sponsored by the Sanctuary of Fatima, if I remember correctly. They had some of this news doesn't always make it into the English speaking world, but the Sanctuary of Fatima, if you do researches online, that they actually did a scientific study on the document a few years ago, and no serious scholar questions that it was written by Sister Lucia. Some people want to believe that it's fake, but you have others that take a more refined approach that say, no, it's authentic. It's just incomplete. There's another text, I don't believe, and this is where a lot of people misunderstand me, I don't believe that the so-called fourth secret of Fatima, sorry, there's a bug flying, is as it is presently understood and argued, is authentic, or is the correct way to look at it. What I say the argument needs to be is that Sister Lucia knew how to be subtle in her writing. We know that she would say things in writing that in fact were from Our Lady, but Sister Lucia would not claim it as such. So you have to, but the only way you're going to know that, how to tell who, like if it's Sister Lucia speaking or Our Lady speaking, is if you know for a fact what it was that Our Lady said. And that's not always clear. It was Cardinal Jewish who said this allegedly to the Italian journalist Marco Tosati, and I myself cited Tosati to this effect in that 2017 Catholic World Report article that I mentioned earlier. And we don't need Jevish's observation to Tosati to know that that is true. It's actually provable in the literature of Fatima itself on specifically Sister Lucia's writings. We can actually demonstrate that. I have another essay that I haven't published yet that kind of gets a little bit more into that angle of things. I think I need to do a little more refining on it before I publish it. But the general idea is you have to be careful when you're dealing with authentic mystics. They're very subtle people. I have an article about this on my website. You have to be extremely careful because they are imbued many of them with the wisdom of God. And true and authentic wisdom knows what to say and how to say it. So right now I was helping somebody with a theological question regarding the theology of salvation and eschatology. And it gets into questions of, for instance, the von Balthasar positions about dare we hope. And I was talking with this person who's actually a watcher, a viewer of RNT. And he quoted St. Cyril of Alexandria, in which St. Cyril taught, there was the question about, how many will be saved. And St. Cyril, discussing what our Lord said in Luke 13, said that this is an idle question. And you'll notice how our Lord gets around it. He doesn't say only 1 million people are going to be saved or damned or whatever. He doesn't get into that. Instead, our Lord takes the opportunity to tell people what is important for salvation. Of course, warning, if you don't do this, this could happen. You could go to hell. But he doesn't engage in these idle speculations. Instead, he turns the question around to what's really important. How do I get saved? What do I need to do in order to attain salvation, eternal life? That's much more a valuable question than knowing the numbers of the damned or the numbers of the saved. There is a time appointed by God for human knowledge to know that, and that is at the second coming of Christ and at the general judgment. So now is not the time for us to know that.
Last one here. Why did the Vatican keep Sister Lucia locked away from people if they weren't hiding anything?
That is a horrifically biased question. No, that is conspiracy theory put out by various traditionalists. Not everybody in the traditionalist world, but by people like Fray Michel, Christopher Ferrara, Father Gruner, Father Kramer, et cetera, et cetera. That was a Fatima Center / Fray Michel thing. Okay. When the Carmelites of Coimbra published their biography of Sister Lucia, they shed light on this very question. And let me pull it up here for you. They shed light on this very question. I always refer people to the Portuguese because the English translation, overall, it communicates the points, but at least most of the points. But I always try to refer back to the Portuguese because I think there's more in the Portuguese. They actually do talk about it in the book. And from my memory, the Carmelites discuss how she went to the Carmel of Coimbra in the first place because Sister Lucia wanted to get away from all of these curiosity seekers, the idle questions, people essentially harassing her. All she wanted to do was to be alone with God. Remember, in the last apparition, October 13th of 1917, Our Lady appeared as Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And a lot of people for many years have tried to figure out, why would Our Lady do that? Well, Our Lady of Mount Carmel represents the glorious mysteries. So this is a representation of, symbolic of how we need to pray the rosary. That was Father Apostoli's interpretation. He was on an episode of Women of Grace with John Benkovich once, and I heard him talk about that. I respect Father Apostoli's opinion. I don't think he was correct on that. May he rest in peace. I think it was the birth or the planting of the seed in the heart of Sister Lucia for the religious life, because she wanted to become a Carmelite nun. And I think it had everything to do. And as a matter of fact, when you look at the Portuguese, when Sister Lucia is describing what happened at the Miracle of the Sun, at first she says, we saw, and then when she starts talking about Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she switches to first person singular, I saw, almost as if to the exclusion of Jacinta and Francisco. So that says something. It's a little, again, subtlety in mystics, right? I think that says something. And I think that's very, very profound. And so because of that, I think that now that when we look at the biography, we see Sister Lucia wanting to be a Carmelite for many, many years. And how when she was with the Dorothean, she was constantly around people, and she's just like, I just want to be alone with God. And then when she got to the Carmel of Coimbra, people were still trying to get to her. And she sought the permission, she sought the bishop's help, the Bishop of Coimbra. And that's where they started blocking things little by little. And I think the bishop eventually went to the Holy See, I think, to get the Holy See involved. That also happened in the 50s or very early 60s. So all of that has to get factored into this. It's not that they were trying to keep her away or whatever else, not necessarily. She wanted to be left to be with God. Now, I don't want to impugn a saint, but I do think that John the 23rd wanted her to be silent. His secretary, later Cardinal Loris Capovilla, talked about this. Actually, no, I think it's in my book, but for sake of visuals, I can give you the book right here. This is John the 23rd in the record or the memory of the secretary Loris Capovilla interview of Marco Roncalli, who I think was the nephew of John the 23rd, with unedited documents. It's published by San Paolo or St. Paul's Books. And they talk about Fatima, Marco Roncalli and Capovilla. And in the course of this interview, Capovilla talks about how John the 23rd kind of wanted to be silent on the question of Fatima. He thought that there was some question there, apparently, and he had some doubt about Fatima, is how Capovilla communicates himself, characterizes this. There is some question in John the 23rd's mind about this. So I don't know entirely what the question is in John the 23rd's mind, but at some point, Capovilla does reveal that Cardinal Fernando Cento, who was the apostolic nuncio to Portugal for the Holy See, approached John the 23rd with the idea of allowing Sister Lucia to give a radio address to the world. He approached the Pope with this shortly after John the 23rd's election in 1958. And John the 23rd, as Capovilla says, preferred silence on the matter. Well, I read that in my research, and I was just like, man, wouldn't it, if John the 23rd had only let her speak, what would she have said? But no, he didn't want it. He preferred silence, as Capovilla stated, in, if not this interview, in another interview. And I always thought that was very strange. It is very, very strange. I think John the 23rd had his vision for the church, and like his famous line in Cum Sancta Mater Ecclesia, Sancta Mater Ecclesia, his opening address to the council, where he talked about the prophets of doom. That is one critique that I think somebody could make of John the 23rd's opening address to Vatican II, which is overly optimistic. And when he condemned the so-called prophets of doom, a lot of people took that as a swipe at, interpreted that as a swipe for Fatima. And I because of what Capovilla says, not because of what I say, but because of what Capovilla says, there's some justification for that. There really is. So we have to have a balance with all of these matters. A lot of healthy balance and respectful discussion in charity, because we are dealing with we are talking about the Holy Father here, So I say none of these things to condemn anybody. I'm just simply saying this is what Capavila has said. And I think we could have just charitable discussions about it. You know,
Real quick, wrapping it up here, if you could maybe just tell us what we have to look forward for the next one. I think that is the final presentation, correct?
yeah, I don't think we have a date just yet for it. We'll probably work that out here soon. But
Yeah.
yeah, we're going. We discussed the nature of heresy and apostasy with the events of the 60s and 70s. So in the sixth and final webinar, I'm going to conclude our discussion with a note of hope about this passion of the church that we experienced in the 20th century, and I think we are still continuing in the here in the 21st. Everybody has to watch all of these webinars before they watch the sixth one, because this is, we're going out with a bang. Like even in this webinar, I very charitably pointed out something, but it was a very stark point when I talked about how Sister Lucia made comments about the pastors of the church in the 60s and 70s. She was saying something very profound, but within the bounds of charity. And I think that's a model for us to follow. And I've tried to follow that throughout these webinars, but we have to really pay attention to what's going on here. And so I encourage people strongly to watch all the webinars again before viewing, tuning into the sixth one, because what happens in the sixth, it will be unintelligible unless you have followed all of these. And if anybody has any questions, there's my website, kevinsymonds.com. I have an about and contact page. People are welcome to contact me. But we're going to pull it all together. We have a lot of stuff floating out there. Now we're going to pull it all together into a certain spiritual theology that I think will help us understand the present situation and or condition of the church and how we need to respond to it.
Excellent. And we'll discuss some dates here, off the air in just a moment, but it'll probably be in a month or less. So everybody look forward to that. Kevin, I want to thank you so much for your time and for doing this.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And if I may just follow up, I mentioned last one that I was going to be going to Boston to help settle my brother's last affairs there. I came back this past Saturday. I ended up being there an extra week, so there for 2 weeks. I'm happy to say that it was a very fruitful 2 weeks, and I would like to give everybody an update at the end of the sixth webinar, how all of that went. It just depends upon how fast things move between now and then. But I'm happy to say that I got a lot of information and some hopeful and good news. So, but I'd like to, hopefully I'll be able to share that with everybody at the end of the next webinar.
Absolutely. Awesome. Okay, we'll do it again pretty soon. Everybody stay tuned for the last of the webinar series. Like I said, maybe in about a month or a little less than that. But I'll put something up on YouTube pretty soon, so you should see a notification. Everybody, thank y'all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Also, check us out, patreon.com/Reason and Theology. If you become a patron there, you'll get access to extra content, which I've been posting on there. And you'll also support what we're doing here so that we can continue to present this content. All right. We'll see you soon. God bless.
God bless.